We all know that Disneyland is full of rich characters, characters that told stories, characters that made the park come to life. But over the years, there's been a handful of Disney's in-park characters that have been washed away in the pages of Disneyland's history. Brickey here, welcome to Disneyland Oddities, episode 4, where we go back into the rich history of Disneyland and uncover some of its oddest and weirdest stories, stitched together in one video just for you. Today, breaking down the canceled characters of Disneyland. The characters that quietly disappeared and became folklore of Disneyland's opening days. Today we're going to discover why they disappeared. Before the word astronaut was even a thing, Disneyland was already ahead of the curve. Picture a towering futuristic couple striding through Tomorrowland in shiny, oversized spacesuits. Bubble helmets on their head, looking like they just stepped off a 1950 sci-fi movie set. And this couple, they weren't just any costume characters, because they weren't promoting a ride, a movie, or an attraction. Because friends, they were the attraction. A living, breathing promise of the future back when we were all just guessing what space travel might actually look like. So who was Spaceman and Space Girl? Why were they cast unusually tall? And what was it like working in the California heat with an aquarium on your head? And most importantly, what happened to Spaceman and Space Girl? Let's blast off into this forgotten chapter in Disneyland's rich history. When Disneyland opened in 1955, the space race was just an idea. The concept of a human traveling beyond Earth was something found in pulp magazines and black and white sci-fi serials. But Tomorrowland? It wasn't just about today. It was about what's coming next. And Spaceman and Space Girl weren't just characters, they were the living embodiment of Walt Disney's obsession with futurism. The Disneyland TV show constantly speculated on space travel, often working directly with aerospace engineers to make bold predictions. And in the middle of all this, guests could come to Disneyland, visit Tomorrowland, and actually meet the future. Of course, the future looked a little campy. Spaceman, officially designated K7, wore a bulky, gleaming white spacesuit with its silver accents. And most famously, his oversized plexiglass dome with tiny air holes. Space Girl, or K8, had a sleeker look, featuring a mini dress, high-heeled silver boots, and for some reason, a cape. Because if there's one thing space travel needed, it was dramatic fashion. If Spaceman was known as K7 and Space Girl was known as K8, does that mean their dog was known as K9? Is that the joke? And if you're wondering why Spaceman and Space Girl, not Space Woman or Space Explorer, congratulations. You've spotted the quiet social hierarchy of the 1950s, where even in the future, men were men, and women, well, they were girls. And Disneyland didn't just put anyone in these suits. Spaceman and Space Girl had to be tall, at least 6 feet or taller, because apparently in the future, we're all gonna be NBA players. So why so tall? Well, partially for spectacle. Guests looking up at towering, otherworldly figures instantly made Tomorrowland feel grander. But the height requirement also helped sell a weird in-universe detail. If Disneyland space people were this tall, then maybe the future held subtle genetic advancements, making humanity slightly upgraded. And it turns out, Spaceman wasn't just a photo op, he was a secret crowd control tool. During peak hours, Spaceman would stroll past long wait lines, casually waving to guests. And like the Pied Piper of Tomorrowland, people would follow him, unwillingly helping to thin out congested areas. And when he arrived at a less crowded attraction, he'd suddenly stop, engage with guests, and voila, instantly boost foot traffic in quieter sections of the park. Spaceman was a space magnet that would draw people in every direction he went. Even in the park's opening days, Disneyland just wasn't thinking about the future, it was actively shaping guest behavior in real time. So it's great in theory, but let's talk about working inside of these spacesuits. Obviously, the costumes were hot, especially under the California sun. The plexiglass dome helmets had barely any ventilation, with just a small couple of holes for breathing. There was one report that oxygen was pumped into the helmet, but I could only find that in one place and I couldn't tell if it was sarcastic or not. So my bet is just a couple of ventilation holes, because that seems to be the more consistent version of the Spaceman story. Spaceman's suit was also bulky and heavy. So how did Spaceman and Space Girl cope with the heat? They got creative. They took lots of breaks and would even sneak into areas where they weren't supposed to go, but were air conditioned. When you time travel back 70 years, it's hard to figure out the difference between fact and fiction. However, there are some wild stories about some of the things that Spaceman got up to. For example, once putting a small transistor radio inside of his helmet so he could listen to the baseball scores. There was also rumors of them sneaking over to the Disneyland Skyway to get away from the heat. Up in the sky, they could take off their helmets and just be a normal couple passing you by as you're looking all around Disneyland. And then ironically, one of the young workers cast to be Spaceman, his name was John Glenn, but not John Glenn the astronaut, John Glenn, Spaceman at Disneyland, who allegedly got fired for wandering over to Frontierland and talking to a cowboy. And that was the legend of how the utilidors were invented. But my favorite part of the legend of Spaceman and Space Girl is what these two got up to in the early days of Disneyland, when nobody was quite sure what this was going to be. They were young people working a summer job, and they got up to some mischief. Sometimes Spaceman and Space Girl would pose motionless, pretending to be statues in the Bell Telephone exhibit. When guests got too close, they'd suddenly move, scaring people half to death. A friend who was a janitor was in on the joke. He would start dusting off the statues while explaining to guests that Disneyland had invented a new kind of synthetic living tissue. Guests, believing they were looking at a statue, would go to grab his hand. When it grabbed back, it also frightened folks. One supervisor informed them, "You guys need to cut this out. You're going to give somebody a heart attack." But it didn't stop them. They were having fun. They were working at Disneyland as the future. But working in the future always comes with a certain sacrifice. For 10 years, from 1955 to 1965, Spaceman and Space Girl were icons of Tomorrowland. They posed for thousands of pictures, guided guests through the land, and played a crucial role in making Disneyland feel like a real-life World's Fair. But then, the future, it actually happened. By the mid-1960s, we weren't just speculating about space travel anymore. In 1961, the first human went into orbit. And by 1969, Neil Armstrong walked on the moon. And suddenly, Disneyland's vision of space, with bubble helmets, capes, and high heels, looked downright campy, which will forever be the fundamental problem of Tomorrowland. It's easy to make bold predictions about the future. It's harder to keep them relevant once the future actually arrives. The striking couple that once felt daring and forward-thinking suddenly seemed outdated and silly. And by 1966, Spaceman and Space Girl quietly disappeared from Disneyland, making way for the next phase of Tomorrowland. The costumes were packed away, the towering performers retired, and Disneyland's vision of space became more grounded in its new reality. But for one brief moment, going back to Disneyland's origins, it gave guests something that no other place in the world could: the ability to meet the future before it arrived. For many Disneyland cast members, working in Tomorrowland felt like stepping into the future, and in one case, quite literally stepping out of it. After her time as Space Girl, 6'3" Shannon Bauman traded in her silver boots for something even stranger. She became a Disneyland mermaid. Yeah, at one point, Disneyland had live mermaids swimming in Tomorrowland's submarine lagoon. Why? Because when Walt Disney was told he couldn't put live fish in the lagoon, he decided to put live people in instead. So let's literally dive into one of Disneyland's strangest, most outside-of-the-box attractions, one that was mesmerizing to guests, brutal for its performers, and destined to be short-lived. Because a live mermaid show? Outside, in the brutal conditions? Only at early Disneyland. Most theme parks rely on props and sets to tell their stories. But in the late 1950s, Disneyland didn't just tell you about a futuristic world, they literally filled it with real people playing the roles. Space explorers in Tomorrowland, frontiersmen in Frontierland, and mermaids in the submarine lagoon. For a magical short-lived time, From 1959 to 1967, not every year, select summers, guests could peer into the water and see actual mermaids lounging on coral, waving to submarines, and performing synchronized swimming routines. It was cheap to operate, it brought more kinetic energy into an already lively water feature, and most importantly, it was unexpected, a true Disneyland oddity, even for its time. How do you get hired to be a Disneyland mermaid? Back in the 50s. Jobs not available anymore. First, you had to pass a very unusual audition. Hopeful mermaids gathered at the Disneyland Hotel pool, where they were judged on swimming skills, long hair, and the ability to stay graceful under extreme stress. Which one of those would be the hardest for you to pass? But friends, the real test, swimming with their hands and feet tied together. You heard me right, because Disneyland executives weren't just looking for any swimmers, they needed women who could porpoise, a dolphin-like movement using only their core strength. If you couldn't propel yourself across the pool while bound at the ankles and wrists, ladies, you were not getting the job. Sounds great, right? Where do I sign up? Well, over 100 participants applied for the job, but Disney would only pick 8 women to go on to become their mermaids. So, what is your reward for such a fantastic job? A $45 a week paycheck and the honor of becoming one of Disneyland's most unusual cast members in its 70-year history. Mermaids wore neoprene tails, custom fitted to each performer, and halter tops decorated with seashells or starfish. And getting into the water, that was a job all unto itself. The women sat on a hidden backstage dock. Their rubber tails were zipped on, then 2 cast members would carry them to the water and lower them in. And one mermaid would stand on the other mermaid's back to help her fit into her suit and zip it up, like full on, like bustier to the max. Once they finally made it to the lagoon, the mermaids had 3 jobs. Perform synchronized swimming routines, wave to the guests from the rock formations, and interact silently with the submarines as they would pass. Keep the Disney magic alive, they were forbidden to talk to Disneyland guests. Not that it mattered, because the mermaids couldn't hear anything from the shore. Between the hum of the submarines, the splash of the water, and the sheer distance from the guests, it meant they could sit on a rock completely detached from the nearby crowd. Hours at a time, these women sat fully visible to thousands of guests, but they were completely alone in their own conversations. Imagine they talked about their lives, their plans for after work that day, and whatever got them through a very physically demanding day. They were just being gals, hanging out in the lagoon. No big. But for an added attraction that on paper seemed so simple, Disney had a very specific way they wanted the mermaids to operate their part of the show and interact with the submarines. The mermaids never entered or exited the lagoon in guest sight. They always had to swim underwater backstage where they would exit and enter. As the mermaids would hang out at the coral in the middle of the lagoon, they would wait for the sound of the submarine to get near them to do their part of the show. And so as the submarine would pass, the mermaids dove underwater, waved and did synchronized flips and spins for passers-by looking out the portholes at live mermaids. Guests could clearly see the mermaids through a small round portal. But here's the weird part. The mermaids couldn't see inside the submarines. Through their underwater vision and the way the water would reflect off the panes of glass, they were basically just looking at a dark mirror, or one might say a black mirror. Since the mermaids couldn't see inside the submarines, they were doing everything based off of sound, not visual cues. And then because they weren't allowed to speak to guests, they relied on eye contact and subtle gestures to interact with each other and to interact with passersby. It may have looked glamorous to passersby, it was anything but that. But while the show looked seamless, the reality was far less glamorous. It didn't take long for the mermaids to realize this would not be the dream job working at Disneyland they thought it would be. This lagoon is not a heated body of water. The ladies would sit inside of 55-degree water all day long. Obviously, if you don't want to be in the cold water and you hang out on the rocks, that exposes you to the California sun. That meant severe sunburns, especially on their shoulders and backs. And Disneyland uses an extreme amount of chlorine to keep this water so crystal blue. You know what that meant? The blonde mermaids, their hair would turn green after just a few weeks. Although I might argue that makes it feel a little bit more authentic. There was the wild card of the guest. Sailors on shore would throw money, sometimes change wrapped in a dollar bill, to get the mermaid's attention, because every woman loves when you throw money at her to get her attention. And one man, he jumped the fence, swam out to them, and nearly got sucked into a submarine propeller before security hauled him off. So by the 1960s, the mermaids were losing the battle not only with the elements, but also with Disney management. And by 1967, Disneyland quietly retired the mermaids from the submarine lagoon due to a mix of practicality and health concerns. Tomorrowland was also changing. There's a good ring to that, huh? What once felt like a fantastic addition to the submarine lagoon started feeling out of place as Tomorrowland would evolve into a sleek, modern vision of the future with its re-theme, Tomorrowland 1967. Another bold Disneyland experiment that was left behind as the park would move forward. As the last mermaids would wave goodbye to Disneyland, another group of real-life adventurers were climbing to new heights. Literally. Right next to the mermaids at Disneyland's Matterhorn, actual mountaineers were scaling its 147-foot peak. Because Walt Disney didn't just want a mountain, he wanted the mountain to feel alive. Because for Walt Disney, it wasn't enough to build the world's first steel roller coaster inside of a mountain. Disney had to go one step further. The park hired professional climbers to scale the rock face, wave at guests, and make the mountain feel like a real thing. And as you would probably expect, these climbers had just as much fun and just as many pranks as the spacemen, space girls that came before them. These mountain climbers had a really great time doing their job every day at Disneyland. It's another one of those insane details that made early Disneyland feel magical, and doing so on a budget. It doesn't take a lot of money or resources to add on these little special moments, something I wish Disney would get back to. I mean, let's just stop and think about this for a moment and remove the context of our reality. Disneyland, building a massive mountain in the middle of Anaheim, was already one of the craziest things they did in their early years. Putting mountain climbers on top of it just takes it a step more into insanity. Whoever that creative genius was that one day goes, "Hey guys, I got an idea. What if we actually put mountain climbers on the mountain?" Well played. Respect to whoever came up with that wild idea. From the moment the Matterhorn opened in 1959, Disneyland turned it into a living attraction. Members of the Sierra Club were invited to be the first to scale the peak, climbing with full mountaineering gear. The climbers would plant Swiss and American flags at the summit. Climbers would be joined by a Swiss yodeler who would sing and play the Alpenhorn as they climbed. Guests weren't just looking at a mountain, they were looking at expedition in action. And for over a decade, the Matterhorn's climbers were some of the most extreme cast members Disneyland ever had. So if you're as curious as me, you're wondering, how did these cast members scale the mighty Matterhorn? Because climbing the Matterhorn, it wasn't just a show. It was a daily job with serious physical demands. The climbers had three main paths that they would take to scale the mountain. The most famous route was the east face overhang, which had the best viewing angles for the most amount of guests. Their daily routine was each climber would climb the mountain 10 times per workday, which seems wild. Workers lasted 6 hours with frequent breaks between ascents. They would wear their signature bright red Swiss-style climbing gear to stand out against the rock, so they would get noticed by the guests down below them. This is where the legend of the basketball court inside of the Matterhorn comes from. It was placed in there to give the climbers a little recreation between their trips up and down the mountain. But it is not a basketball court. It's not even a half basketball court. It's just a basketball goal with enough room to take your shot. So I'm sure when you were in your 20s and you were doing a summer job, you might have pulled a couple of pranks or two in your day. I know that I did. Well, wait till you hear this one. It has to go down as one of the most epic summer job pranks of all time. And it happened right here. Two climbers decided to put on an unplanned show for the guests down below. They started their usual climb up the east face overhang, the most visible route. As they neared the most dramatic section of the ascent, his belayer let him drop lower than usual, making it look like he had actually just fallen down the side of the mountain. There, he dangled motionless. Meanwhile, their yodeler suddenly started playing a dramatic rescue tune on his Alpenhorn. His co-worker climbed up to him and in an exaggerated hurry, pretend to perform a mid-air rescue. At the base of the eastern summit, a large crowd started to gather. The largest crowd these two climbers had ever seen. But they hadn't just fooled the guests below, there was somebody else that they had fooled, and this wouldn't work out well for them. Because the pair had also fooled Disney executives and Disney paramedics, who were waiting for them at the summit of the mountain to continue this rescue. And when they learned it was all a stunt show that they decided to perform on their own, they were not happy. Advised to never do it again or they would instantly be terminated from their job. Did it stop them? Probably not. Just imagine standing at the base of the Matterhorn thinking that you are seeing a real rescue taking place. God bless those two. For nearly 20 years, the Matterhorn climbers were one of Disneyland's most visually stunning live performances. So why did it end? In the late 70s, Disneyland was moving away from its handmade charm and embracing a more streamlined, controlled show experience. The climbers were quietly retired, and if you felt like you've seen them past the 70s, you weren't wrong. Occasionally, they would make appearances for special events or just a special surprise in the park. But the daily spectacle of seeing a real person climbing Disneyland's tallest mountain was sadly gone forever. Enjoyed today's episode of Disneyland Oddities? Make sure you check out this one right here where I question, was there really an animatronic graveyard put inside of Frontierland? Thank you so much for showing up, and thank you to my magic Brickeys for making today's video possible. I appreciate my channel members, and I appreciate everyone else who showed up today.